Wyoming Territory, 1873. The Dust of Redemption's Gap was a living thing. It rose from a single, wide street with the passage of every wagon and horse. A fine golden powder that coated window panes, settled in the creases of worn leather, and clung to the brim of a man's hat. It tasted of grit and distance, of solitude and sun-baked earth. From the window of his office, Sheriff Caleb Blackwood watched it swirl in the late afternoon light, each eddy and gust a familiar, silent companion. Caleb knew the language of this town better than he knew his own heart. He knew the groan of the saloon doors, the sharp crack of the blacksmith's hammer, the weary sigh of the boardwalk planks beneath a heavy tread. These were the sounds of his world, a world he had meticulously constructed from silence and duty after the noise of his previous life had been brutally extinguished. His office was a testament to this order. A neatly stacked pile of paperwork on one corner of his desk, a rifle cleaned and oiled in its rack against the wall, a tin cup resting precisely beside a bucket of clean water. It was a fortress of routine, and he was its solitary warden. He was a tall man, built with the spare, hard lines of someone who lived on the edge of scarcity, even when there was plenty. His face, weathered by sun and wind, was a map of grim landscapes, the only softness found in the gray of his eyes, which held the permanent shadow of a distant storm. Most folks in Redemption's Gap saw only the badge pinned to his vest, a five-pointed star of burnished tin that seemed to reflect not the light, but the weight of the law he carried. They saw the sheriff. They did not see the man who, in the dead of night, sometimes traced the faint, pale line on his ring finger where a band of gold used to rest. His past was a locked room, the key long since thrown away. He had come west to forget, to bury the man he had been beneath layers of dust and duty. Attachments, he had learned with the brutal finality of a spade striking frozen earth, were vulnerabilities. Love was a warmth that only made the eventual cold more unbearable. A man survived alone. It was the first and last commandment of his new existence, a creed written in the scar tissue around his heart. He protected the town not out of any sense of community, but because it was a job, a set of predictable problems that could be solved with a firm word or a fast draw. It kept his hands and his mind occupied, leaving little room for the ghosts that whispered in the quiet hours. He leaned against the window frame, the rough hewn with a familiar pressure against his shoulder. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the vast, empty plains in hues of orange and bruised purple. The air grew still, the dust settling for a moment's peace. It was in this quiet that the sound came, a faint, mournful cry that traveled for miles across the open land. The train whistle. It was the only thing that arrived on time in this territory, a daily intrusion from a world he had left behind. For most, the train meant mail, supplies, the rare new face. For Caleb, it was a disruption. It was a metal serpent breathing steam and noise into his carefully curated silence, disgorging passengers who carried with them the complicated sense of hope and desperation, ambition and failure. He watched it emerge from the heat haze on the horizon, a black smudge growing steadily larger, its rhythmic chuffing a counterpoint to the slow beat of his own heart. He felt a familiar tightening in his gut, the ingrained wariness of a man who expected trouble as surely as he expected the sunrise. He straightened up, his hand falling instinctively to rest on the worn grip of the Colt Peacemaker, holstered at his hip. The train was a breach in his defenses, a tear in the fabric of his solitude. He did not know why this particular arrival felt different, why a strange premonition prickled at the back of his neck like a cold draft. He only knew that the world was about to knock on his door, and he had no choice but to answer. He stepped out of his office and onto the boardwalk, the heels of his boots making a hollow, lonely sound as he walked toward the station, toward the plume of steam and the screech of iron wheels that signaled the end of his piece. The train hissed to a stop, a great beast sighing out its exhaustion. Steam billowed across the platform, momentarily obscuring the handful of people who disembarked. There were two drummers in city suits, their faces already grimacing at the dust, and a family of homesteaders, their expressions a mixture of weariness and fierce, fragile hope. Caleb's gaze swept over them, assessing, categorizing, dismissing. Then, through a thinning veil of white vapor, he saw her. She was a stark contrast to the unforgiving landscape, a delicate brushstroke of color on a canvas of brown and gray. Her traveling dress was the deep blue of a twilight sky, impeccably tailored but now creased and dusted with the grime of a long journey. A small, elegant hat was pinned to hair the color of warm honey, which had been coiled into a neat chignon, though a few rebellious strands had escaped to curl at her temple. She stepped down from the carriage with a grace that seemed entirely out of place, her gloved hand clutching a small reticule, as if it were an anchor in a strange and turbulent sea. Alara Vance took her first breath of Wyoming air and felt her lungs fill with dust. It was drier, sharper, and vaster than anything she had ever known in the genteel, tree-lined streets of Philadelphia. The sheer scale of the sky was overwhelming, a brilliant, aching blue that stretched to an infinite horizon, unsoftened by tall buildings or familiar church spires. She blinked against the glare, her eyes scanning the small cluster of faces on the platform, searching for the one she had traveled 2,000 miles to see. She was looking for a Mr. Abernathy, a man whose letters had been her lifeline for the past 6 months. He had written of opportunity, of a position as a governess for his sister's children, of a new life far from the suffocating pity of her Philadelphia relations after her parents' sudden passing. His words had painted a picture of a respectable, thriving community, a place where a woman of good breeding and modest means could make her way. Her gaze moved from a grizzled man with a station master's cap to a pair of women in calico dresses, their faces etched with curiosity as they stared at her. There was no sign of the kind, middle-aged gentleman from the photograph he had sent. Caleb remained in the shadow of the station's overhang, a silent observer. He watched the hope in her eyes flicker and dim as the last of the passengers claimed their baggage and dispersed. The drummers headed for the saloon. The Homesteader family was met by a man with a buckboard wagon, and soon she was left standing alone beside a large, handsome trunk. The station master, Silas, a man whose face was as cracked and weathered as old leather, approached her hesitantly. Caleb could not hear their words, but he could read the story in her posture, the slow straightening of her spine, the slight lift of her chin, a fragile defiance against a rising tide of panic. Silas shuffled over to Caleb, pulling a rag from his pocket to wipe his sweaty brow. "Sheriff," he muttered, his voice low, "that lady, a Miss Vance. She's a skin for Mr. Abernathy. Says he was supposed to meet her. Promised her a job, a cold, hard knot formed in Caleb's stomach. He knew the name. Abernathy, a smooth-talking grifter who had passed through Redemption's Gap 2 months prior, leaving a trail of small debts and a bad taste in everyone's mouth. He had last been seen heading west, toward the gold fields in Montana. Abernathy cleared out weeks ago, Silas. Paid his hotel bill with a bad bank draft, Silas cursed under his breath, his gaze drifting back to the solitary woman. Figured as much. What do we do? She's got no one. Looks like she spent her last dollar getting here. Caleb's first instinct was to detach. It was not his problem. He was the law, not a guardian for the naive. He could direct her to the boarding house, advise her to wire for funds, and wash his hands of it. It was the sensible thing to do, the safe thing. It was the creed. But as he looked at her, standing so still amidst the vast indifference of the plains, something shifted within him. He saw not a problem to be managed, but a person utterly and completely alone. It was a loneliness he recognized. Dusk was bleeding into the sky, the shadows lengthening like grasping fingers. The last of the sunlight caught in her honey-colored hair, setting it ablaze for a brief moment. She looked small and terribly vulnerable. With a sigh that felt like it was dredged up from the deepest part of him, Caleb pushed himself off the wall. The decision was made, not with logic, but with a reluctant tug of some long-dormant impulse. He walked toward her, his steps measured and slow. He saw the moment she noticed him, the way her shoulders tensed, her hand tightening on her bag. Her eyes, the color of moss after a rain, widened with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. He stopped a few feet from her, careful to keep a respectable distance. "Miss Vance?" he asked. His voice was rough from disuse, a gravelly sound that seemed to startle her. "Yes," she answered, her own voice a surprise, clear and steady, though quiet. "I am she. Have you seen a Mr. Abernathy? I was given to understand he would be here to meet me." He chose his words carefully, seeing no point in softening the blow. The frontier was not a place for soft edges. "Mom, I'm Sheriff Blackwood. I'm afraid the man you're looking for is no longer in Redemption's Gap. He left town some time ago." He watched the blood drain from her face, leaving her skin as pale as porcelain. Her composure, so carefully maintained, began to fracture. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. She swayed slightly, a sudden, dizzying dip, as if the ground had given way beneath her. Caleb reacted without thinking. He closed the distance in a single stride, his hands reaching out to steady her. His fingers closed around her upper arms, the fine wool of her dress surprisingly soft beneath his calloused hands. She stumbled forward, her forehead bumping against his chest, the ridiculous little hat knocked askew. For a moment, she was just a dead weight against him, and he was struck by how slight she was, how fragile she felt in his arms. He could smell the faint, clean scent of lavender clinging to her clothes, a scent of gardens and rain-washed linens, of a world utterly alien to his own. The unexpected intimacy of the contact sent a jolt through him, a current of warmth that was both unwelcome and deeply startling. He held her there, his hands firm on her arms, the setting sun at his back, a stranger in his embrace, and felt the first crack appear in the walls of his solitude. Alara felt the world tilt and darken at the edges. The sheriff's words had been a hammer blow, shattering the last of her carefully constructed hopes. For a dizzying second, the vast, empty landscape seemed to rush in, threatening to swallow her whole. Then she was falling, only to be caught by strong hands. Her face pressed against the coarse fabric of a man's vest, and the solid, unyielding feel of him was the only thing keeping her upright. She could feel the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart against her cheek, a slow, powerful drum that seemed to calm the frantic fluttering in her own chest. The scent of leather, dust, and something uniquely masculine, clean soap and cold night air, filled her senses, a grounding reality in her spinning confusion. She pushed herself back abruptly, her cheeks flushing with heat. I beg your pardon, Sheriff. I am quite all right." The words were a breathless lie. Her legs felt as substantial as water. Her hat was askew, and she reached up a trembling hand to right it, the gesture a desperate grasp for some semblance of dignity. Caleb released her instantly, stepping back to give her space. The brief warmth of her against his chest lingered, a phantom sensation he tried to shrug away. "No need for apologies, ma'am." The news was a shock. He saw the panic warring with pride in her green eyes and made a swift calculation. The town's only boarding house was run by a woman with a tongue as sharp as a branding iron, and the saloon was no place for a lady alone. There was only one respectable, immediate solution. It was a complication he did not want, but one his conscience would not allow him to shirk. "My home is just there," he said, gesturing with his chin toward a sturdy log building at the end of the street, which had his office attached to the front. "My housekeeper, Martha, resides with me. You would be safe there for the night, until we can sort things out." The offer felt foreign on his tongue, a breach of his most fundamental rule. Alara looked from his impassive face to the building he indicated. It looked solid safe. The mention of a housekeeper was a balm to her frayed sense of propriety. She had no money, no prospects, and knew no one in this harsh, alien place. The sheriff, for all his grim demeanor, was offering a sanctuary. She had no other choice. "You are very kind, Sheriff Blackwood," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I will be most grateful." Caleb gave a curt nod, avoiding her eyes. He hoisted her heavy trunk onto his shoulder with an ease that spoke of a life of physical labor, the muscles in his back and arms bunching under his shirt. "This way, Miss Vance, the walk down the main street felt 100 miles long. Alara was acutely aware of the pairs of eyes that followed them from the windows of the general store and the doors of the saloon. She could feel their curiosity like a physical touch, their unspoken questions hanging in the dusty air. She was the stranger, the outsider, arriving under the protection of the town's solitary, unapproachable lawman. She lifted her chin, her back straight, mimicking a confidence she did not feel, focusing on the rhythmic thud of the sheriff's boots on the boardwalk beside her. Martha was a woman who seemed to be made of the same tough, unyielding material as the land itself. She was stout, with iron-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and hands that were chapped and strong. When Caleb explained the situation in his usual terse phrases, her sharp blue eyes assessed Alara from head to toe. For a moment, Alara feared she would be turned away, but then the older woman's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Well, the poor dear," Martha said, her voice surprisingly gentle. "Come in, child. Don't you stand there, letting the night chill get you. I'll put a kettle on for tea." The inside of the house was as Spartan and orderly as the office, but Martha's presence had layered a sense of home over it. A colorful quilt was draped over the back of a simple wooden settee. A pot of herbs sat on the windowsill in the kitchen, and the air smelled of baking bread and wood smoke. It was clean, warm, and safe. Alara felt a wave of gratitude, so profound it brought tears to her eyes, which she fiercely blinked back. Later, after a simple but hearty meal of beef stew and fresh bread, they sat in the main room. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Martha had retired to her own small room at the back of the house, leaving Alara and Sheriff Blackwood in a silence that was thick with unspoken things. He sat in a straight-back chair, cleaning a rifle with meticulous, practiced movements, his focus entirely on the task. Alara sat on the settee, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The borrowed shawl Martha had given her pulled close around her shoulders. She knew she had to speak, to explain herself beyond the bare facts of her arrival. She could not bear to be an object of charity or suspicion. "My parents passed away last winter," she began, her voice quiet but clear in the still room. "The influenza. It was very sudden. They left very little. The house in Philadelphia had to be sold to cover their debts." Caleb did not stop his work, but she saw his hands pause for a fraction of a second. He continued to listen, his head bent over the rifle. "Mr. Abernathy was a business acquaintance of my father's from many years ago," she continued, the story tasting like ash in her mouth. "When I wrote to him, he was so kind. He offered me a position, a chance to start again. He made it all sound so respectable, so hopeful." She looked down at her hands, a bitter smile touching her lips. "I see now that I was a fool, a naive Easterner, easily deceived." Caleb finished his task and carefully reassembled the rifle, the metallic clicks loud in the silence. He finally looked at her, his gray eyes unreadable in the firelight. "It is not foolish to hope, Miss Vance. It is merely dangerous." The words hung between them, heavy with a meaning she could only guess at. She saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a deep, ancient pain that resonated with her own fresh grief. It made her bold. "And you, Sheriff? Do you no longer find it dangerous?" He looked away, his gaze fixed on the flames. The muscles in his jaw tightened. For a long moment, she thought he would not answer. He seemed to retreat back into his fortress of silence, and she regretted her forwardness. But then he spoke, his voice low and rough. "I had a wife," he said, the words sounding as if they were being pulled from him one by one, "and a daughter. A small farm back in Ohio." He paused, and the silence was filled only by the crackling of the fire. "There was a fever. It swept through the county. I was away, selling livestock. When I returned," he did not need to finish the sentence. The empty finality of it was absolute. "I learned that hope is an anchor. It can hold you steady, or it can drown you." In that moment, the grim, imposing sheriff disappeared, and she saw only a man hollowed out by loss. His grief was older than hers, more deeply settled, a part of the very grain of him. But it was a language she understood perfectly, An invisible thread of shared sorrow stretched between them, weaving the first true bond in the quiet, firelit room. She saw the kindness he tried so hard to conceal beneath his gruff exterior, the honor that had compelled him to help a stranger when it would have been easier to turn away. He, in turn, saw not a fragile city girl, but a woman of quiet strength, one who had faced the wreckage of her life and still had the courage to travel 2,000 miles in search of a new one. "I am so very sorry for your loss, Sheriff," she said softly, her sincerity absolute. He gave a single, sharp nod, accepting her sympathy without comment. He stood and placed the rifle back in its rack. "The name is Caleb," he said, the offering a small but significant concession. "You should get some rest, Miss Vance Alara," she replied, offering her own name in return. "And thank you, Caleb, for everything." He merely nodded again before turning and heading for his own small room, leaving her alone with the dying embers of the fire. She watched him go, a man who had built walls around his heart so high he could barely see over them. But tonight, she thought she had seen a glimpse of the man inside, and she felt a strange, unsettling flicker of a hope she had thought was extinguished forever. The next few days settled into a strange and quiet routine. Alara, unwilling to be a burden, insisted on helping Martha with the household chores. She learned the rhythm of life in the sheriff's house, the pre-dawn ritual of grinding coffee, the methodical sweeping of dust that seemed to regenerate overnight, the quiet, shared meals. She discovered a surprising aptitude for baking, her loaves of bread rising higher and lighter than even Martha's with each attempt. The work was grounding, the simple, physical tasks a welcome distraction from the uncertainty of her future. She began to see the town of Redemption's Gap not as a place of desolation, but as one of stark, uncompromising beauty. She learned the names of the constellations in the vast, ink-black sky, so much clearer and brighter than the gaslit haze of the city. She saw the subtle shifts in color on the plains at sunrise and sunset, a palette of rose, gold, and violet that took her breath away. She was demonstrating a resilience she had not known she possessed, adapting to this new world with a quiet determination that did not go unnoticed. Caleb watched her from a distance, a silent observer of her transformation. He saw the way she spoke kindly to the solemn-faced children who played in the street, the way she no longer flinched at the sudden bray of a mule, the way her hands, once soft and gloved, were becoming chapped and capable. He had expected her to be a delicate thing, to shatter like glass against the stone reality of the West. Instead, she was proving to be as supple and strong as willow, bending without breaking. This realization was deeply unsettling. He found his thoughts drifting to her at odd moments during his patrols. The sound of her low, clear laughter as she talked with Martha in the kitchen, the sight of her silhouette in the window as she read by lamplight in the evenings, the lingering scent of lavender and baking bread that now permeated his once sterile home. She was an intrusion, a splash of vibrant color in his monochrome existence, and he felt his carefully constructed defenses beginning to erode, grain by solitary grain. His respect for her grew with each passing day. She never complained or spoke of her misfortune. Instead, she actively sought employment. She spoke to Mr. Henderson at the general store, offering to help with his bookkeeping. She approached the schoolteacher, a stern spinster named Miss Albright, to see if an assistant was needed. She was met with polite but firm refusals. The town was small, its resources stretched thin. There was simply no place for a woman of her particular skills. One afternoon, two strangers rode into town. They were not cowboys or prospectors. They wore dark, city-made coats and bowler hats that looked out of place, and their faces were hard and watchful. They dismounted in front of the saloon, their eyes sweeping the street with a predatory stillness that set Caleb's teeth on edge. He watched them from his office window, his hand resting on the butt of his Colt. Trouble had a certain look to it, and these men wore it like a second skin. Later that day, he saw them speaking with the barkeep, their heads bent close together. He made his way over, his steps silent on the dusty street. He entered the saloon, the cool, dim air smelling of stale beer and sawdust. The two men fell silent as he approached the bar. "Afternoon, Sheriff," the barkeep, a portly man named Gus, said, his voice a little too jovial. Caleb nodded at him, his gaze fixed on the two strangers. "Anything I can help you gentlemen with?" The taller of the two, a man with a long, scar-like smirk, turned to face him. "Just passing through, Sheriff." Asking a few questions, his eyes were small and dark, like chips of obsidian. "We're looking for a lady. Just arrived from back east. Philadelphia, to be exact." Answers to the name Vance. The air in Caleb's lungs turned to ice. He kept his face a mask of bored indifference. "Can't say I have. Lots of people pass through." The second man, shorter and thicker, spoke up. "This one's special. She might be carrying something that don't belong to her. Something our employer, Mr. Thorne, is very keen to get back." Caleb's mind raced. Thorne. The name was unfamiliar, but the implication was clear. Alara was not just a victim of a simple grifter. She was in some kind of serious trouble. His protective instincts, long dormant, roared to life. "If a lady fitting that description comes to my attention, I'll be sure to let you know," he said, his tone flat and dismissive. He turned and walked out, the men's cold eyes boring into his back. He found Alara in the small patch of garden behind the house, where Martha was trying to coax some hardy vegetables from the dry soil. She was on her knees, carefully tending to a row of struggling tomato plants, a smudge of dirt on her cheek. The late afternoon sun illuminated her, and for a moment he was struck by how much she looked like she belonged there, her honey-colored hair coming loose from its pins, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows. The sight filled him with a fierce, terrifying wave of possessiveness. "Alara," he said, his voice sharper than he intended. She looked up, startled, shading her eyes with a soil-stained hand. "Caleb? Is something wrong?" He had to warn her, but he also had to shield her. He could not let her see the fear that was coiling in his own gut. "There are two men in town asking about you. They work for someone named Thorne." She frowned, her brow furrowing in confusion as she rose to her feet, brushing the dirt from her skirt. "Thorne? Bartholomew Thorne?" The name was spoken with a note of distaste. "He was a business associate of my father's. A ruthless man. My father despised him, but was also indebted to him. I cannot imagine why he would send men looking for me. I have nothing of his." "They seem to think you do," Caleb said grimly. "I want you to stay in the house. Do not go out alone. Do you understand?" The words were an order, born of a sudden, desperate need to keep her safe. She bristled at his tone, her chin lifting. "I'm not a child, Sheriff. Nor am I a prisoner. You are under my protection," he countered, stepping closer, his voice dropping low. "And you will do as I say." These are not men to be trifled with. His proximity was overwhelming, his shadow falling over her. She could see the raw urgency in his gray eyes, and her own indignation faltered. She saw that his anger was not directed at her, but at the threat she represented. She gave a small, reluctant nod. The next day, the threat escalated. Alara was helping Martha hang laundry on the line behind the house when she saw them, the two men from the saloon. They were standing at the end of the alleyway that ran beside the general store, watching the house. Watching her, a cold dread trickled down her spine. She quickly gathered the rest of the wet linens in her basket and hurried back inside, her heart pounding. She told Caleb as soon as he returned for the midday meal. His face became a thundercloud. He said nothing, simply buckled his gun belt, which he had taken off, back around his hips and walked out. Alara watched from the window as he strode directly toward the two men. They saw him coming and straightened up, their hands moving subtly toward their coats. Caleb stopped a dozen feet from them, his stance relaxed but ready. "I believe I told you, gentlemen, that the lady you're looking for isn't here," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the quiet air. Redemption's Gap doesn't take kindly to men who stare at its womenfolk. "I suggest you move on," the taller man chuckled, a humorless, grating sound. "Is that so, Sheriff? Or maybe you just want her, and whatever she's carrying, all to yourself." Caleb's hand did not move, but his whole body seemed to radiate a lethal stillness. "This is your only warning. Be on the next train heading east, or I'll put you on it myself, in a pine box, the men exchanged a look. They were armed, and they were 2 to 1. But there was something in Caleb's eyes, a complete lack of fear, a promise of swift and terrible violence, that gave them pause. After a tense moment, the scarred man shrugged. "All right, Sheriff. We'll be on our way." They turned and sauntered back toward the saloon, but Alara did not miss the backward glance they threw, a look filled with malice and calculation. They were not leaving. They were just waiting for a better opportunity. That opportunity came 2 nights later. A storm had rolled in, a furious tempest that lashed the town with sheets of rain and cracked the sky with brilliant flashes of lightning. Caleb had been called out to the Miller Ranch, where the creek was threatening to flood its banks and carry away half of their livestock. He had left under a darkening sky, telling Alara and Martha to bolt the doors and keep the lamps low. Alara sat by the window, watching the storm, a book lying forgotten in her lap. Martha was dozing in her chair by the fire. A sudden, violent crack of thunder shook the house, and in the subsequent flash of lightning, Alara saw them. The 2 men, hunched against the rain, moving stealthily toward the back of the house. Her blood ran cold. She flew to Martha's side, shaking her awake. "Martha, they're here. The men from town." Martha was instantly alert, her eyes wide. "The back door," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The bolt is old." Just then, they heard a splintering sound from the kitchen, followed by a heavy thud as a shoulder hit the door. Alara's mind raced. They were trapped. The front door led to the office and the street, where they would be seen. The back door was their target. There were no other exits. Panic threatened to overwhelm her, but then she thought of Caleb, of the quiet strength he had shown, of the unspoken trust he had placed in her. She would not be a helpless victim. "The flour bin," she hissed, grabbing Martha's arm and pulling her toward the large wooden bin in the corner of the kitchen. "Help me drag it." Together, the 2 women strained, their feet slipping on the wooden floor, and managed to shove the heavy bin against the door. It was a flimsy barricade, but it would buy them time. Another crash rattled the door, and a crack appeared in the wood. "He's coming back," Alara said, more to convince herself than Martha. "Caleb will be back." Outside, Caleb was riding hard, the wind and rain tearing at him. The situation at the Miller Ranch had been resolved quicker than he'd expected, and a gnawing unease had urged him to return to town at a gallop. He'd seen a light where it shouldn't be, a lantern moving in the alley behind his house. His heart leaped into his throat. He spurred his horse, the animal's hooves churning the muddy street into a thick slurry. He dismounted before the horse had even come to a full stop, drawing his colt as he rounded the corner of the building. He saw the shorter of Thorne's men standing lookout while the taller one put his shoulder to the back door again. "I told you to leave town." Caleb's voice cut through the howl of the wind, cold and deadly. The lookout spun around, his hand flying to the gun under his coat, but he was too slow. Caleb fired once. The man grunted, stumbling back against the wall, his gun clattering to the muddy ground as he slid down into the darkness. The man at the door kicked it open, the flour bin scraping backward, and burst into the kitchen, a pistol in his hand. Caleb charged in after him, the storm at his back. Inside, the scene was illuminated by a single flickering lamp. He saw Alara, her face pale but resolute, standing with Martha behind the overturned kitchen table. The thug raised his pistol toward them. There was no time for a clean shot. Caleb lunged, tackling the man around the waist, and the 2 of them crashed to the floor. The gun went off, the shot deafening in the enclosed space, the bullet burying itself in the ceiling. They wrestled on the floor, a tangle of limbs and fury. The man was strong, his muscles corded and powerful. He brought the barrel of his pistol down, aiming for Caleb's head. Caleb twisted, the blow glancing off his shoulder with a flash of white-hot pain. He grunted, driving his elbow hard into the man's ribs. The man gasped, his grip loosening for a split second. It was the only opening Caleb needed. He slammed the man's hand against the floorboards again and again until the gun fell from his nerveless fingers. Caleb seized it, reversed it, and brought the heavy butt of the pistol down on the man's temple. The thug went limp beneath him. For a moment, There was only the sound of Caleb's ragged breathing and the drumming of the rain on the roof. He pushed himself to his feet, his shoulders screaming in protest. He looked at Alara, who was staring at him, her eyes wide with shock and fear, but also with a fierce, undeniable courage. He had saved her. In that violent, chaotic moment, his duty as sheriff and his personal, desperate need to protect her had fused into a single, unbreakable purpose. He had stepped between her and death, and in doing so, had bound himself to her in a way that he could no longer deny or ignore. The walls were not just cracked, they were beginning to crumble. In the aftermath of the attack, a heavy, oppressive silence settled over the house, broken only by the steady drumming of the rain. The captured thug was bound securely to a chair in the office, unconscious and bleeding slightly from the gash on his temple. His partner lay dead in the mud outside, a grim testament to the night's violence. Martha, after ensuring both Caleb and Alara were unharmed, had retreated to her room, her face pale and drawn, leaving them alone in the kitchen. The room was a shambles. The back door hung from a single hinge. The heavy flour bin lay on its side with its contents spilled across the floorboards like a fresh snowfall, and the kitchen table was overturned. Alara stood amidst the wreckage, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, shivering despite the warmth of the room. She was staring at the dark stain on the floor, where Caleb's shoulder had bled before Martha had hastily bandaged it. Caleb watched her, a storm of emotions raging inside him. He had seen the terror in her eyes when the man had burst through the door, and the image was now seared into his mind. He had brought this danger to her. By allowing her to stay, by allowing himself to feel anything for her, he had put her directly in the path of violence. The ghosts of his past rose up, their whispers turning into a roar. He had lost his family once because he had not been there to protect them. He would not make that mistake again. The only way to keep Alara safe was to remove her from his life. The creed, his harsh and lonely creed, reasserted itself with brutal logic. A man survives alone, and those near him suffer. His face hardened into a mask of cold resolve. He began righting the table, the sharp, scraping sound of its legs on the floor making Alara jump. He did not look at her. "You'll be on the morning train," he said, his voice flat and devoid of any emotion. The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. She stared at his back, at the rigid set of his shoulders. "What?" she whispered, her voice trembling. He turned to face her then, and the man she saw was not the one who had shared his story by the fire, not the one whose eyes had softened when he looked at her in the garden. This was the sheriff, a stranger with eyes of cold, gray stone. "This is my fault. I should have sent you away the day you arrived. As long as you are here, you are in danger. You will pack your things. I will give you enough money to get back to Philadelphia." Alara felt a hot surge of anger and hurt rise up to choke her. "You think money will solve this? You think sending me away is the answer? My life is not some problem you can simply dispatch on the next train, Sheriff." "It is no longer your concern," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "It is mine, and I am ending it." He was pushing her away, building the walls back up, brick by painful brick. He had to make her leave for her own good. He had to sever this connection before it became a fatal one. Tears of frustration and betrayal welled in her eyes. "And what of me?" she cried, her voice cracking. "I have nothing to go back to. This was beginning to feel like a home. I thought." She trailed off, unable to voice the fragile hope that had taken root in her heart. She saw now that it had been a foolish weed, growing in barren soil. He did not want her. He saw her only as a liability, a piece of baggage to be shipped back where it came from. "You thought wrong," he said, the lie tasting like poison in his mouth. He saw the devastation on her face, the way the light in her eyes was extinguished by his cruelty. It was a necessary wound, a clean cut to prevent a deeper infection. He turned away from her, unable to bear the sight of the pain he was inflicting. "Pack your bags, Alara." Heartbroken and humiliated, Alara fled to the small room that had been her sanctuary. She sank onto the bed, the sob she had been holding back finally breaking free. He was casting her out. After everything they had shared, After the moments of quiet understanding and the terrifying ordeal they had just survived together, he was sending her away. The coldness in his eyes had hurt more than any physical threat. She wept until there were no tears left, leaving only a hollow ache in her chest. Sometime in the deep hours of the night, when the storm had passed and an exhausted quiet had fallen, she began to pack, her movements stiff and mechanical. She folded her few dresses and placed them in her trunk. As she reached for the small, leather-bound volume of poetry her father had given her, her fingers brushed against a loose panel in the trunk's lining. It was a detail she had never noticed before. Prying it open with her fingernails, she discovered a hidden compartment. Inside, nestled amongst yellowed letters, was a slim, black ledger. Curiosity overriding her grief, she opened it. The pages were filled with her father's neat, precise script. It was a detailed record of business transactions, dates, names, and figures. The name Bartholomew Thorne appeared again and again, linked to shipments that were never officially recorded, payments to customs officials, and dealings that were clearly illegal and fraudulent. Her father, a man she had believed to be the soul of honor, had been trapped in Thorne's web, and this ledger was the proof. It was the evidence of every crime, the weapon Thorne feared. This was what the men were after. A sudden, clarifying rage burned through her sorrow. The danger had never been about Caleb. It had followed her from Philadelphia. It was her burden, her fight. And Caleb, in his misguided, arrogant attempt to protect her, was trying to send her away from the one place she might actually be able to make a stand. Running back to the east would not make her safe. Thorne's reach was long. It would only leave her alone and vulnerable. Her resolve hardened. She was not the same woman who had stepped off the train weeks ago. She was not a helpless damsel to be rescued and dismissed. She would not run. She closed the ledger and placed it back in its hiding spot, her mind racing. She did not know what she would do, but she knew she was not getting on that train. The next morning broke clear and cold, the air washed clean by the storm. Caleb had not slept. He had spent the night in his office, guarding his prisoner and wrestling with his own demons. The man had woken up, sullen and uncooperative, but Caleb knew he would talk eventually. He looked out the window at the rising sun, his heart a heavy, aching weight in his chest. Sending Alara away felt like tearing out a part of himself, but it was a price he was willing to pay for her safety. He heard a noise from the back and tensed, but it was only Alara stepping out into the garden with a bucket and a broom. He watched as she began, with methodical determination, to sweep the spilled flour and mud from the kitchen porch. She was not packing. She was cleaning. She was claiming her space. Before he could confront her, a new sound reached him. The thunder of approaching horses, far too many for a simple traveler. He stepped onto the front boardwalk and saw them, a party of at least 6 riders, led by a portly man in an expensive suit, cresting the rise just outside of town. The captured thug in his office saw them too, and a slow, triumphant smile spread across his bruised face. "Looks like Mr. Thorne decided to come collect his property himself," he sneered. Caleb's blood ran cold. Thorne was here. He had underestimated the man's ruthlessness. He was outmanned and outgunned. His first thought was of Alara. He had to get her out. He burst back into the house. "Thorne is here. You have to go. Now." Out the back, head for the stables, Alara turned from her sweeping, her face calm and set. In her hand, she held not the broom, but a heavy iron skillet from the kitchen. "No," she said, her voice ringing with newfound strength. "I'm not running. This is my fight, Caleb. The danger is because of me, and I have what he wants." She held up the black ledger, which she had retrieved from her trunk. "It's my father's record of Thorne's crimes." Understanding dawned on Caleb, followed by a fresh wave of dread. "Give that to me," he commanded. "No," she repeated, her gaze unwavering. "We will face this together." The riders were thundering down the main street. There was no more time for argument. "Get inside," he snarled, pushing her toward the doorway. "Bar the front door. Stay away from the windows." He checked the loads in his Colt and grabbed the rifle from its rack, his mind a whirlwind of tactical calculations. This was no longer about sending her away. This was about surviving the next 10 minutes. The house became their fortress. Thorne and his men dismounted, spreading out to surround the building. "Sheriff," Thorne's voice boomed from the street, oily and arrogant. "I have no quarrel with you. Send out the girl and the ledger, and we will be on our way. No one else needs to be harmed. You're not getting either one, Thorne." Caleb yelled back from the office window. "Ride out now, or be carried out." A gunshot shattered the window pane next to his head, and the siege began. Gunfire erupted from all sides, splintering the wood of the walls and sending glass flying. Caleb returned fire, his movements economical and precise. He was a proficient marksman, but he was pinned down, unable to cover all the angles at once. In the main room, Alara was crouched behind the heavy oak desk, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was terrified, but a strange sense of purpose held her panic at bay. She was not a bystander in this fight. She was the cause of it. She watched as Caleb moved between the front window of the office and the side window of the living area, his face a grim mask of concentration. She saw one of Thorne's men creeping along the side of the house, trying to get a clear shot at him through the side window. Caleb was focused on the man in the street. He did not see him. Without a second thought, Alara acted. She grabbed the heaviest book from the desk, a thick county legal codex, and hurled it through the main room window, shattering the remaining glass. The sound was a diversion, drawing the attention of the men on the street for a precious second. But the man at the side of the house was undeterred. He was raising his rifle, taking aim. There was no time to warn Caleb. Alara looked around wildly, her eyes landing on the iron skillet she had dropped by the door. She snatched it up. As the thug leaned in through the broken window frame, preparing to fire, she swung the heavy skillet with all her might. It connected with the side of his head with a sickening thud. The man's eyes rolled back in his head, and he collapsed soundlessly into the bushes below. Caleb heard the noise and spun around, his gun raised, expecting the worst. He saw Alara standing there, breathing heavily, the skillet clutched in her hand like a weapon of war, her eyes blazing with a fierce, protective fire. She had just saved his life. The brief lull was broken by a new, more terrifying sound, the crackle of flames and the smell of smoke. Thorne, growing impatient, had ordered his men to set the house on fire. Smoke began to pour in from the back. "We have to get out," Caleb yelled, grabbing her arm. The main street was a death trap. Their only chance was the back, through the fire. He kicked open the broken back door and was met with a wall of heat and smoke. The rear porch was engulfed in flames. In that moment, with the roar of the fire in his ears and the house coming down around them, all of Caleb's walls, all his rules, all his carefully constructed defenses were incinerated. The thought of losing Alara, of failing her as he had failed his family, was an agony beyond comprehension. Nothing else mattered. Not his past, not his pain, not his solitude. Only her. He pulled her close, his hand cupping the back of her head, his eyes boring into hers with a desperate intensity. "Alara," he said, his voice raw with emotion he could no longer contain. "I was a fool, a blind, stubborn fool. Pushing you away was the biggest mistake of my life." Smoke stung their eyes, and the heat was becoming unbearable. "I love you. Do you hear me? I love you." Tears streamed down Alara's face, mingling with the soot. Through the chaos and the terror, his words reached her, a declaration of life and hope in the heart of the inferno. "I love you too, Caleb," she choked out. The confession hung between them, a perfect, incandescent truth in a world of smoke and flame. Just then, a volley of shots erupted from the far end of the street. The townspeople, roused by the sustained gunfire and the sight of the sheriff's house ablaze, had finally come to his aid. Led by Gus from the saloon and the blacksmith, a small but determined group of armed citizens opened fire on Thorne's men, catching them in crossfire. The tide had turned. Thorne, seeing his advantage lost, screamed at his men to retreat. Caleb seized the opportunity. He soaked a blanket from the water bucket and threw it over Alara's head and shoulders. "Stay low and run for the stables. Don't stop," he commanded. He provided covering fire, his rifle cracking, forcing Thorne's remaining men to keep their heads down. Alara ran, her lungs burning, her heart pounding with love and fear. Caleb followed a second later, firing as he went, the heat of the flames scorching his back as the roof of his home, the symbol of his solitary life, finally collapsed behind him in a shower of sparks and embers. The resolution was swift. With the town now an armed and angry militia, Thorne's men scattered. Thorne himself, trying to mount his horse, was brought down when the blacksmith shot the animal out from under him. He was captured, along with 2 of his wounded men. The ledger, which Alara had tucked into the bodice of her dress, was safe. The rule of law, bolstered by the courage of ordinary people, had won. As the smoke cleared and the last of the flames were doused by a frantic bucket brigade, Caleb found Alara near the stables. She was safe, smudged with soot and weeping with relief. He pulled her into his arms, holding her as if he would never let go. The empty space in his life, the hollow ache he had carried for so long, was filled with the solid, breathing reality of her. He had almost lost everything again, but this time he had not been alone. He looked down at her, his callous thumb gently wiping a smudge of ash from her cheek. "I meant what I said in there," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Every word, I know," she whispered, her hand coming up to rest on his chest, over his heart. "I know." The townsfolk kept a respectful distance, but their approval was a palpable thing. They had seen her bravery, her refusal to be a victim. She was no longer the out-of-place Easterner. She was one of them. Gus the barkeep gave Caleb a wide grin and a thumbs up. Martha hurried over, clucking and fussing over them both, her eyes shining with unshed tears of joy. Later that evening, as the moon rose over the charred remains of his house, Caleb took Alara's hand. He led her away from the center of town, toward a small, quiet bluff that overlooked the vast, sleeping plains. The air was cool and clean, smelling of rain-washed sagebrush. He stopped and turned to face her, his hands enclosing hers. "I have nothing left, Alara. My home is gone. Everything I owned is ash. You have me," she said softly, her green eyes luminous in the moonlight. "And I have you. We have everything that matters." He reached into the small pocket of his vest and pulled out a simple, delicate gold ring with a tiny sapphire. It had been his mother's. He had carried it with him from Ohio, a relic of a past he had tried to bury, but which he now saw as a bridge to his future. "I know this isn't the right time, with everything that's happened, but I can't wait another minute to ask. I don't want to face another sunrise without you by my side. Alara Vance, will you marry me? Will you build a new life with me, right here, out of the ashes?" Tears of pure joy traced paths through the soot on her cheeks. Her answer was a choked, breathless yes. He slid the ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. He drew her close and kissed her, a kiss that was not about desperation or fear, but about promise and beginnings. It was a kiss that sealed the end of his solitude and the start of their shared future. The town might gossip, the world might judge, but in that moment, none of it mattered. He pulled back just enough to rest his forehead against hers. "You don't need their approval," he whispered, his voice a low, steady promise against the vast silence of the prairie. "You only need mine." And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, that he would spend the rest of his life proving he was worthy of hers. 2 years later, the Wyoming sun, a benevolent gold in the late afternoon, streamed across the porch of the new house. It stood on the same spot as the old one, but it was different. It had been built not just by Caleb, but by the men of Redemption's Gap, a testament to the community that had claimed him and Alara as their own. The house was larger, with blue-painted shutters that had been Alara's specific request, and a wide, welcoming porch where 2 rocking chairs sat side by side. A climbing rose, which Martha had declared would never survive the harsh winters, was defiantly blooming, its pale pink flowers a splash of delicate color against the sturdy log walls. The town of Redemption's Gap had grown, too. The evidence provided by the ledger had led to the conviction of Bartholomew Thorne and the dismantling of his corrupt enterprise. With his shadow lifted, new settlers had begun to arrive, drawn by the promise of a town where the law was firm and the community was strong. The single street was busier now, the sound of the blacksmith's hammer more constant, the laughter of children more frequent. Caleb stood on the porch, leaning against a post, his sheriff's badge catching the light. He was still the lawman, but the harsh, solitary edges of him had been softened. The lines on his face were still there, but they were gentler now, crinkling at the corners of his eyes when he smiled, which he did often. He watched as Alara sat in one of the rocking chairs, a 1-year-old boy with a shock of dark hair and his mother's bright green eyes sleeping soundly in her arms. Alara had blossomed in this wild land. She had started a proper school, transforming the one-room schoolhouse from a place of rote memorization into one of genuine learning and discovery. She was respected, admired, and loved, not just by her husband, but by the entire town. She wore a simple calico dress, her honey-colored hair in a practical braid down her back, and she looked more beautiful and at peace to Caleb than she ever had in her fine Eastern clothes. She looked up and met his gaze, her smile warm and content. "He's finally asleep," she murmured, her hand stroking the soft hair of their son, Daniel. "He fought hard," Caleb said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. He pushed himself off the post and came to sit on the porch steps at her feet, leaning his head back against her knees. She threaded her fingers through his hair, a familiar, comforting gesture. "He has his father's stubbornness," she teased softly, "and his mother's spirit," he countered, reaching up to take her free hand, bringing it to his lips. The sapphire on her finger glinted in the sun. He looked out at the plains, at the endless stretch of land under the vast sky. It was no longer a symbol of his isolation, but of their future, of the limitless possibilities that lay before them. He felt the gentle swell of her belly against his back, the promise of the new life they were creating together. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked quietly. "Philadelphia. The gardens, the society, the life you left behind." Alara was silent for a moment, her gaze following his out to the horizon. "I miss my parents," she said, her voice thoughtful. "But I do not miss that life. It was a cage, Caleb, even if the bars were gilded. I was not truly myself there. Here," she squeezed his hand, "I am home. This is where I was always meant to be." He turned his head, looking up at her. The love he felt for her was a vast and powerful thing, as immense and constant as the sky above them. It was the anchor that held him steady, not the one that threatened to drown him. He had learned that love was not a weakness, but the greatest strength a man could ever know. It was the foundation upon which their life was built, a structure far stronger than any log house, one that could withstand any fire, any storm. "This town was named Redemption's Gap," he said, his voice thick with a gratitude that still humbled him. "I never understood why until you arrived. You are my redemption, Alara." She leaned down, her lips brushing his forehead. "And you, my love, are my home." Daniel stirred in her arms, making a soft, contented sound in his sleep. The sun dipped lower, painting the clouds in fiery strokes of orange and pink. On their porch, in the heart of the wilderness they had claimed as their own, the sheriff and the refined pioneer sat together in the peaceful quiet, their shared future stretching out before them, as bright and boundless as the Wyoming sky.